Hello and welcome to the Octopus Revenue Podcast. This is an educational and informative podcast series all about hotel revenue management. We have some great discussions for you in each episode to give you insights and tips on all of the major issues facing us in the hospitality industry. It's no revelation to any of you that COVID-19 has had a major impact on our industry. The big question is, though, how do we bounce back and how do we do it safely? We want to help you get an understanding of what's going on and how those of us in the revenue management community can effectively and proactively respond and plan for recovery. There's never been a better time to share ideas and pass on knowledge to support one another, because the road out of this might be long, but we're all on that road together. In this episode, we are joined by Andrew Glover, Head of Revenue Management at Best Western Hotels. We will hear Andrew's views on pricing and how hotels can avoid a race to the bottom. Andrew's confident that revenue management systems will work, but it's only a matter of time. Hi Andrew, great to have you join us today.
Hi Sarah, thanks, it's good to be here.
Just for the listeners, Andrew, can you give us a brief overview of your role at Best Western?
So I head up the revenue team within Best Western. So we have a small team based out of our offices in York who are there to support our member hotels with all elements of revenue strategy within the brand. We also operate a paid revenue management service which is available to our members, and so they'll outsource the revenue management to us, and we will manage that on their behalf. So we have a team of 20 revenue managers looking after hotels across the country, across the various band spectrum within Best Western.
So the last 3 months, Andrew, it's been, a mix of highs and lows for everyone. How have you found it? Have you worked right through, or have you had some time off?
I've worked right through. I think, like many people, over the last few weeks, you wake up and think, is this really happening? And what has actually happened since the end of March? And like anybody else, it's been an absolutely extraordinary few weeks. I've worked right through. There's been a huge amount for us to do, potentially firstly closing down hotels and now preparing to reopen them back up, and what that might look like and how we actually come out of this in the best way that we can for our hotel members.
I think the management of cancellations back in the early days in March was quite an insurmountable task, to say the least.
Absolutely. I mean, you never, it's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime event, really, certainly in my career, where we're faced with this situation. So, people were learning as they went along, really, but an absolutely huge task in terms of the management of that, absolutely.
And I think now that we're coming out of the other side, hotels are gearing up now to reopen. So what kind of areas from a revenue management perspective are you focusing on just now in preparation?
So we're kind of looking, like anybody else, at what segments will return and how we manage those. So we're very much thinking about the different areas of revenue management, the different locations we have our hotels in, what demand might look like for those hotels, how we position our pricing, how we make sure that we maximise on the segments as they return, and as we start to understand how they return and what demand is likely to be certainly over the early weeks, and then how we manage that over the coming months as well.
How have you kept up to date with trends over the recent months, and what have been your go-to tools?
I think, to be honest, as much news as possible, and wherever you can get that news. We historically in revenue management look to historical data, look to our current trading, look to our market performance, look to the key performance indicators that we measure to gauge how we're performing and what the future is looking like. That essentially all came to a halt as hotels closed their doors. So myself, like anybody else, looked to other places, other people, other organisations to grasp onto anything, to see really what the future might look like. I kind of liken it to being thrown over the side of a ship and you're looking for a buoy or something to stabilise. Just any information that you can get, whether that be opinion, whether that be some statistics on other markets, how other countries are performing, anything that might indicate what the early weeks and early recovery might look like to help us plan our strategy, really. So news, they're always there, and as much of it as possible, that's how I've tried to keep myself up to date, to try and gauge how we might come out of this.
And I think once hotels start to reopen, everything will be slightly different. You've mentioned revenue managers would typically go to historical data. How do you think in the early days revenue managers will adjust their focus if they don't have that information at hand?
I think it's going to be very much in the early days. It's going to be very much day. It's going to be day to day. Hotels will open their doors. Will all their competitors open the doors at the same time? What does the local market landscape look like on early opening? In terms of price positioning, that is going to be absolutely key, and people are going to be watching the markets very closely to see where those prices are positioned at. And I firmly believe from the moment the doors open, well, even now, that rate shopping tools, etc., are going to be a revenue manager's new best friend, certainly over the early weeks, as we start to see what the trend might look like.
And just on other systems and tech, some hotels rely heavily on the systems that they have in place. Do you think the reliance on technology such as an RMS would become more or less significant in the early days of reopening?
Well, it's an interesting question. We've talked a lot about RMS systems over the past few weeks. I'm a big fan of revenue management systems. I think they help revenue managers make better decisions, and they will do again. But we all know that they work on historical data, on booking trends and algorithms. They're going to be, as much as we are, a little bit in the dark in terms of how much should we rely on them. I think it's going to be difficult certainly over the early weeks to fully rely on an RMS system. And I think RMS providers in the early days may need to do some reconfiguration of their systems to where they point them looking at historical data. I think it's going to have to be a lot shorter lead that they're looking at. The trends will come back, and a revenue management system will look at a trend and it will eventually pick up, and it will come back and become useful again to hotels. But in the early days, what is a recommended price point going to look like? How much are we going to be able to rely on what a forecast is coming out of these systems? I think we're going to have to edge on the side of caution with them, certainly over the early days, but I think they will come back, as business trends start to come back in. I firmly believe that they'll come, return to being a go-to tool for every revenue manager who's using one.
And do you see in the early days brands winning over and above independent properties?
I do think they may have an advantage, certainly from everything that you kind of hear about what's going to be important to people over the early weeks and months. And there is very much the feeling that people will want reassurance, they'll want trust that they're going to a safe, clean, trusted venue. And I do think brands who have the power to have those assurances in place might give customers that increased confidence and therefore might give the edge in terms of recovery in the early days.
We've spoken a lot recently around demand in the early days of reopening and what that might look like. How should a hotel go about resetting their pricing strategy now in preparation for reopening?
Yeah, pricing is going to be key, and I think some of the things here are understanding where your price point was previously within your competitive set. What does that look like now? And are you still competing in the same market that you were pre-COVID? Are all the competitors open back up? It's been well documented that there is an expectation that the leisure market will be the first to recover. So how is pricing positioned around that market, and that will be key. And I think some of this will be. I've talked about rate shopping tools. I firmly believe they'll become absolutely invaluable. But there will be some elements of readjusting pricing to see what effect that has on demand. And I think for some revenue managers, going back to some basic price value matrix exercises against the open comp set to position their pricing will be something that they need to do. I also believe that as we start to understand or start to see what demand is going to look like, there might be need for revenue managers to carry out some controlled price testing in their market to see what the effect is there. But it's going to be, I think we could see a huge amount of pricing changes, particularly in the early days, as we see how the markets start to recover. And hotels will be looking very closely at each other to see what we're doing with our pricing. I can see a lot of pricing changes coming in, and given the fact that we're going to be on a reduced demand, so we're all going to be competing for a much smaller pot potentially initially, reacting to those changes very quickly is going to be ever more important.
What happens if properties within a comp set reopen with a much lower rate than before COVID? How do we avoid a race to the bottom on market selling rates?
I think this is a brilliant question, and I think if we look back to the last financial downturn, when we saw competition over selling rates here, we know that once we lose selling rates, it takes a long time to get them back, and there are no winners in our industry. We're less profitable when rates are lower, and it's not always the right thing to do. And I firmly believe that if the leisure market is there to return, people will want a good price in a safe, clean venue. But I think also there'll be a willingness to pay from some people to get away. People have been in a lockdown a long time. There are a lot of people who've not had their summer holiday, their European break, who want a nice extended stay in a nice destination. And there could be a willingness to pay from some of these sectors. So I think it's very dangerous for us to immediately go in with a low rate, because it could just catapult then, and we just get further and further to the bottom, and then trying to get that back up can take a long time. So I think it's we talked a lot pre-COVID about the rise in experiential travel and the demand for that. I think that's absolutely going nowhere. That's what people want now. So rather than going for immediate price cutting, the other things that hotels can do, and think about how they can value add in there. What experiences can they bring to people to encourage them into their hotels? And I think thinking of other ways to drive demand rather than just slashing prices will kind of curtail that a little.
We've touched on the last financial crisis back in 2008, and back then we came out of it with revenue managers in the business who had never revenue managed during an upturn. So now we have the reverse. We're going to have revenue managers who have never revenue managed in a downturn. What are the best ways to re-educate those revenue managers?
Yeah, so we will have, in the industry, there will be revenue managers who are relatively new, who've been in the business 2-3 years and, have known a relatively buoyant economy. They will have their routine, they will have their go-tos, they will have their techniques which they've learned and use and put into practice. I think it's about educating them to look differently, look at the different segments, look at how you drive demand through different areas, through customer demographic, through market segmentation, through different channels, and educate them that during this period of time that we're probably going to have to try different things and see what the effect is. So I think there is going to be some education around of making a decision and then really evaluating what the impact of that was, and whether it's something that we can use again.
And we've heard a lot about flexibility being the key message out to those domestic leisure customers, just to give them peace of mind that they can change their travel plans if need be. So with a high volume of cancelable rates booked, how do you think this will impact forecasting, and what advice can you give to hotels who may be a little bit worried about producing a realistic forecast?
Yeah, good question. So it will come back, and I think this comes back to trends again. So in the early days, forecasting is going to be challenging for many revenue managers. Will a revenue manager hit a 3 or 5% tolerance of forecast versus actuals over the first few weeks? I don't think we blame many if they didn't, but certainly, as the months start to progress and we get later into the year, we will start to see some trends. Revenue managers will start to learn what those trends are, and forecasting will again become more accurate. So yeah, it will certainly be challenging in the early days, but it will come. It will come as we start to understand what the new normal looks like.
And what do you think the impact of COVID will have on market segmentation?
I think market segmentation might become ever more blurred. I think over the last few years, potentially to a certain degree, market segmentation lines are more blurred than they certainly were 10 years ago. I think revenue managers will perhaps look more to channel production over market segmentation in the future. And I think to be honest, that was probably a trend which was happening anyway. It might just speed that trend up.
Recently in the news, we've read Europe's largest coach tour operator, Shearings, collapsed into administration. In some properties, groups can be a high percentage of the overall business, especially over key months, for example, summer or December for Christmas residential groups. What advice can you give to hotels who really don't know how they're going to replace that level of business?
Yeah, and that's going to have a huge impact on some hotels. I mean, we can look at the group sector and the travel trade sector as, UK domestic and inbound. Certainly the inbound for the immediate future, group travel is going to be heavily impacted. And what will the UK domestic travel trade sector look like after all of this? I think, for hotels which are heavily reliant on this sector, it's going to be about looking at different ways and different groups that they can bring in. And I think this goes a little bit back to experiential travel. So there are there niche groups or activities in their area or different organisations that they can appeal to drive some group business through other ways rather than the traditional travel trade sector. But certainly, travel trade for some hotels is a key part of their business, and replacing that volume with transient business potentially is a lot more difficult. So I think they'll be looking to other group sectors and how they can drive the demand from those into their hotels.
As it stands, we don't have any guidelines around larger social gatherings. For many of your properties that may rely on larger events such as weddings, what sort of guidance are you offering them at this stage?
Yeah, so this is going to be difficult for a lot of hotels, Sarah, to be honest. 2020 was set out to be a good year for weddings. We are seeing a number of hotels reporting weddings moving into next year. So, if we get to the point next year where rules are relaxed, it could actually end up being a great year for weddings in 2021. I suppose, in terms of banqueting and space, etc., probably the more immediate one hotels will be thinking about as Christmas and what happens with that as well. And, we're really, really reliant on what the guidance is going to be here. So, what we'd say around this one is actually, if we are servicing Christmas party nights and banquets actually on a reduced capacity, what does that look like, and do we have to revisit our pricing to see what's viable and what profit we can generate through reduced capacities in that space.
It'll be interesting times ahead, especially on the event side. Just to round off, Andrew, if you could list 3 positives at all to come out of this, what would they be?
Yeah, and thanks. So we have to try and take every positive from any situation. I do believe if there are any to take out of this, is that it has absolutely reunited us as an industry. I think there is a huge amount of support for local businesses and the local economy, which I think we'll see the benefit of coming out the other side of this. It's absolutely forced us to think differently, and you see things which businesses are doing now with takeaways and deliveries, making a success in any way that they can. And I think, that creativity will pull a lot of businesses through.
And that's a great positive note to end on, Andrew. It's been a pleasure chatting to you today. Thanks for your time, and I wish you all the best for the road to recovery for your hotels.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks for listening to the Octopus Revenue Podcast. If you like this episode and you want to hear more, please subscribe so you'll be notified when we release new episodes.